Another dawn, another day, but not just any old day, because this is the day where I get my perch rods out again. As soon as the weather starts to cool and the day length shortens, and I can't help but turn my attention to these wonderful, wonderful fish. Now, I tried very, very hard not to have favourites, but I do have a particular soft spot for these incredible looking creatures. With the bold black bars and bright red fins and beady eyes, it's difficult not to be impressed. Bait wise this year, or for this session at least, I was using king prawns and some micro pellet. Now I've come to the conclusion that raw king prawns make a very, very good bait on any water where there are gudgeon present. To my mind at least, they look about the right size, the right colour and the right density. And as we all know, gudgeon are a favourite food of big perch, and the raw prawn fits the role admirably. Now, the waters that I've got earmarked for my perch fishing this year are slightly different. Historically, and undoubtedly this year I will go back to, I generally fish the commercials, and the margins tend to be quite shallow, by which I mean under 3 foot. And my usual approach is to use a very, very sloppy ground bait, but a couple of the waters that I'm looking at this year, the margins are far deeper, in excess of 4 foot, and dropping away quite quickly, and I'm not sure that my sloppy ground bait is going to get down to the level that I want it to, and so instead I thought I would try a micro pellet. Now, some of that is based on the fact that I've got micro pellet that I needed to use up, and some of it is based on the fact that in this particular water there aren't any carp, because using pellet where carp are present inevitably ends up with carp destroying the swim. But in order to get the freebies down to the bottom where I wanted them, I thought that the micro pellet was a better option than my usual ground bait approach. Now, I'm aware that some very, very good perch anglers tend to ground bait for the perch themselves using chopped worm, using liquid worm, maggots, prawns, etc. I much prefer to bait for the silverfish and get those moving around the float, and so when the perch turn up, the silvers scatter and it's just my hook bait left in the swim. And you can see I'm actually using 2 rods here, which is slightly unusual for me. That's partly because I'm trying out a couple of different ways of fishing this deeper water. I'm not convinced that a fixed float is necessarily the best way to do it, although it was the fixed float that disappeared underneath the lily pads. And I'm also fishing, although the floats aren't very far apart, they're about 18 inches in depth difference, and as it's a new water to me, it was in my head at least, it was a good idea to try 2 rods, just because I could try more spots. Again, the thinking is I'd be quite, twice as good. The reality is that I'm half as good, because I can't concentrate on both floats. So, but I try. So once I get a feel for where the fish are, more likely than not I shall revert back to just using the 1 rod. But I was also interested to try out an inline float on the 2nd rod, and work on a couple of ideas I've got for fishing these deeper margins. But having started the day with a 2-pounder, I carried on with a 2-pounder. Slightly different looking fish, big shoulders on this fish, slightly older looking fish to my mind, but a lovely looking specimen and clearly over 2 pounds. This is the inline float. I've got some ideas. It seems to take a lot of bulk shot, but I'm tempted to maybe try float ledgering at some point and see if that proves indication. But it was the margin rod, or the rod on the margin side of the lily pads, that seemed to be getting most of the action. But I don't feel entirely comfortable using a fixed float at this sort of depth. I know it's not super deep, but I do think that it can compromise bite indication slightly once you are fishing over 4 foot deep. I also think it can compromise the strike, because obviously the float is the first point of resistance and you're striking to the float, and then you have to strike through the float and down to the hook. And I certainly missed a few bites, but I hooked more than I was missing, including this cheeky little chap with his gaping maw, capable of engulfing a whole king prawn. Now, when I'm fishing, I do have, the only superstition I have is to do with magpies, and I always feel more confident if I see 2 magpies on the way to a lake. On this day I'd seen none, and then as I was sitting there, one flew past. I quickly saluted him and said, "Good morning, Mr. Magpie," but I wasn't quick enough because I missed a bite. And it plays on my mind that much that by this point in the day I was almost considering going, off the back of seeing one magpie. But then his good lady wife flew by, and I managed to salute her and wish her a good morning, even though it was quite late in the afternoon. And I was glad I did, because sure enough the other float went, and there was another good perch on the line. And I do get the impression that perch, similar to carp, I think there are holding areas where you have resident fish, but I also think there are shoals or groups of perch moving around these ponds as well. And perch do tend to stick to their year classes. You do tend to get either big shoals of small fish or small shoals of big fish, like this one. And a group of perch is known as a swagger, and I'm sure that the action I was seeing was as each swagger came through, because I was getting a couple of fish per time. They were very similar in size, and it quietened off again, and then sure enough, after a lull, another bite, almost as if another group had swum along the margin and arrived at this bunch of lilies. But cover's always going to be a good place to start with perch regardless. And I think all the lilies around this pool have probably got a resident population. It might only be 1 or 2 fish, or it might be a bunch of small fish, but I'm sure there are every one. But then in addition, as I say, there's groups or swaggers of perch moving around, and if you can entice them in by keeping the silverfish feeding and causing a disturbance, then you will draw them towards the hook bait. And they were getting bigger. This was a lovely looking fish, a really nice looking fish. incredible for condition for so early in the season, and you can only imagine how it's going to be looking come sort of February, March time as they start to spawn up. And it was the trusty old holdfast that was leading the way in terms of fish, and this is one of the reasons why I tend to feed, or I prefer feeding the silvers rather than the perch, because you can keep putting the bait in and keep it going in, and keep those fish coming. And a lot of these little dips on the float are just the silverfish hitting the line as they're chasing the pellet down. But you do have to keep your wits about you, because if the float dips and moves, then it could well be a pickup. And there was a certain irony to the fact that the smallest bite of the day came from the biggest fish. And again, this sort of gives weight to the thought that these are going round in groups, because these last two fish were both very, very impressive. Beautiful clean fish, really, really nice. And so the best advice I have for perch fishing, if you're off out onto the bank, is remember to salute your magpies.